Okay, so this is the last video in this particular part of Chapter 11 dealing with this massive 18-step process of contraction. And so one of the interesting effects involved here that you may not think about is about rigor mortis. And so rigor mortis is that state after death, a few hours after death, about 3 or 4, where the body goes into a stiff contracture state. And you may have heard those anecdotes about people on the table in the morgue that suddenly rise and scares the crap out of everybody there, right? But that is the state of rigor mortis when inappropriate muscle contractions happen. And so in rigor mortis, we see the hallmarks are that the sarcoplasmic reticulum is deteriorating. Why? Because you're dead. And because you're dead, the membrane begins breaking down and just begins oozing out and leaking calcium. That's one major reason rigor mortis occurs. So if we have calcium being released, what does that do to troponin? It acts on the troponin, which causes the tropomyosin to sink out of the way. And before those proteins deteriorate, then the active sites will be exposed. The other major requirement in rigor mortis is that the ATP that stimulates the release portion, remember, ATP binding to the bulbous head, and then you have your immediate release stroke. Well, you don't make ATP anymore because you're dead. And so if there's no more ATP, you don't get release. So those bulbous heads stay stuck to the active sites on the actin, and the calcium is going to have them exposed because it's getting leaked out. So between those two processes, you're going to have a contracture, a prolonged contracture, and it can last well over, even up to 2 to 3 days after death has occurred. The peak's generally about 12 to 16 hours after death, but nonetheless, you're still going to have some that happens even after that time point. Okay, everything will stay in line until finally all the proteins begin degrading a couple, 2 to 3 days after death. All right, so that's rigor mortis. But let's go back and review the very most important things that we've covered in the last few videos about contraction. We know all the components of the sarcomere, and so when you have contraction, you know the ones that will change position and the ones that won't change position. And we know that the thick filaments are stationary. That means the M line is stationary, doesn't move. The A band doesn't change size. And the, what else won't change size? Well, those are the two major things, right? They will not change. The width of the A zone will stay the same. But what does change? Well, you're going to have the Z lines move closer together, so they change position. The I band will change size because you've shrunk that gap between the Z disc and the light area at the end, or in between the end of the myosin and the Z disc. So you've shrunk that area that exists there. You've also changed the zone of overlap, right? Because you've increased that by causing the actin, the thin filaments, to change position and move closer to each other. We've also altered the zone of overlap. So let's look at a summary of everything we've covered. So the muscle fibers were shortened as we slide those thin filaments over the thick filaments. The thick filaments do not change position. It's the thin filaments that change position. The whole idea here is to get calcium released into the cytoplasm. And once we do that, that binds to the troponin, acts on the tropomyosin, causes it to sink out of the way of the active sites of actin, and then will allow the binding of the bulbous head of myosin to that active site on the actin molecule. Okay, we've covered these. I just wanted to go through. This is a nice little review video you might refer to when you're studying for the exam. Contraction is very much an active process. Absolutely requires ATP and lots of it. Relaxation, though, is passive, right? The sequestering of the calcium, or the vacuuming up of the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, will result in a natural passive process for relaxation of the muscle fibers. Once again, we've got myosin. This is the sliding filament model. This is another presentation of it. So We have the myosin heads that have the hydrolyzed ATP on them, so they have an ADP plus an inorganic phosphate, and they now are going to attach to the active site. You can see that as these little brown bubbles on the actin molecules, and they're exposed, so the myosin molecule is going to attach to that and form a cross bridge. Okay, now we have this hinging part right in this region where, like the flex part of a straw, a bendy straw, and that will flex then and hinge in the power stroke, driving those two thin filaments nearer to each other in the sarcomere. You get an ATP binding to the bulbous head, and it will immediately release from the active site in the release stroke. The ATP will hydrolyze and we'll start all over again. And this continuous cycle, I think, is a beautiful pictorial summary of it, will show you the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. Here's another overall summary. I like this kind of slide that shows these overall summaries. We get the action potential on the membrane. It's produced here in these first 6 steps, remember, for excitation. We have the release, we have the binding of the receptor, the formation of the action potential in the muscle membrane, its entry into the T-tubule. You will see the action potential then cross the little bit of cytoplasm that separates it from the terminal cistern of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We've got tons of calcium now that are starting to flood, binds to the troponin, which causes the tropomyosin to move out of the way, which then exposes the binding sites. We then will get the contraction cycle, the sliding filament model occurring, and eventually we'll have the vacuuming up of the calcium ions into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that will allow for the passive process to occur of relaxation and the covering again of the active sites on actin molecules. Yet another way to visualize it, as it's pointed up there, must be important, or I wouldn't try to provide you many different ways to think about how this process occurs. And this is a much more simplistic look at it. Obviously, you'll have to know a few more details of what's shown here, but nonetheless, this is a nice quick way to kind of think about what the process is. So before we leave this particular section of Chapter 11 and head into the second part of Chapter 11, let's talk about what kind of toxins there are out there that affect skeletal muscle operation and their causation of paralysis. So when you interfere with this formation of the contraction sequence, then you can result in a paralyzing of the muscles. Some pesticides block the function of cholinesterase. That's going to cause a continuing stimulation of the receptors in the sarcolemma at the motor end plate, and thus a continuing release of calcium, and thus a continuing contraction. And that's called spastic paralysis. And you'll just be completely contracted. You can't relax it at all. So that's possible. There are a series of drugs and compounds out there. And this is caused, and this is an example, is Clostridium tetani, or the reason we get DPT shots, right? Diphtheria, pertussis, toxin, and tetanus, right? So we get tetanus vaccinations, and they prevent this development of spastic paralysis from Clostridium. Okay, just a couple other little avenues here associated with that particular toxin. What about botulinum? Botulinum toxin, its role is to prevent release of acetylcholine from synaptic vessels. So if we don't have any release of acetylcholine, this kind of goes back to that myasthenia gravis example. If we don't have any release of acetylcholine, we're not going to have any stimulation at the motor end plate, and thus no contraction is possible. This is also a type of paralysis that we'll describe in a second. Botulinum you don't buy dented cans. Why? Because they can have the botulinum toxin in them. And so what happens is, but results in a type of paralysis called flaccid paralysis. So we have spastic paralysis where we're always in a contracture state, or we can have spastic, flaccid paralysis where we absolutely can develop no muscle tone. You'll see that botulinum toxin is used in positive ways, right, in Botox, and there are many applications of Botox. It can relieve crossed eyes. It can relieve what's called blepharospasm. I hate when that happens, right? You start getting that fluttering that occurs in your eyelid, and if it's a chronic condition, they can apply Botox. Remember, flaccid paralysis, that will cause those muscles to quit twitching so much. Vocal cord spasms that can interfere with speech. Anything to relieve wrinkles, certainly used for that quite commonly. Chronic back pain that comes from muscle spasms, we can relax those. Curare is used, South American Indians use it, right? We can get it off poison dart frogs and utilize it there. What does it do? It blocks acetylcholine receptors by inhibiting the sodium intake. So everything's worked fine till then. The acetylcholine's blocked to its receptors at the binded to its receptors at the motor end plate, but the sodium channel then that's opened usually when that happens is blocked now by Curare. It will not allow the entry of sodium. So the end effect is the same. We don't get an action potential or electrical signal develop on the membrane, the sarcolemma of the muscle cell, hence no calcium release, no contraction. This again is an example of flaccid paralysis. We use this during surgery to relax the skeletal muscles, and that's why they have to intubate you and supply the pressure, right, release to cause the respiratory cycle while you're under surgery. There are also drug compounds that inhibit acetylcholinesterase. We already briefly talked about those, but I bring them up now because we're discussing Curare. So what they're going to do is they're going to prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine. So if we apply an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor after applying Curare in surgery, we can reverse the effects essentially. We can overwhelm the receptors with so much acetylcholine, we can activate more receptors than we usually do, and we can begin to reverse that flaccid paralysis and allow the patient to recover. This is also used in these conditions. You can imagine its importance in myasthenia gravis. That would make sense that the problem there is we have those immune system antibodies that are blocking the receptors, but if we have so much acetylcholine and it's competing with those antibodies that sometimes that acetylcholine will win the battle and bind to the receptors and will be able to stimulate some muscle contraction there.